we can continue talking about the problems um, associated with consuming large amounts of meat. And let's break those into two general categories. One, those that are generated by particular cooking methods, and those generated by contamination of the meat by some organism, or in the case of, say, mad cow disease, some toxic molecule. All right, so beginning with how we cook our meat. We'll talk in a few minutes about barbecuing and grilling. Application of fire is a really great way to burn protein and meat in particular, and that's can be very tasty. But exposure to temperatures that are high enough to begin burning the meat generate a lot of molecules that are toxic and also potentially carcinogenic. Polycyclic aromatics, those are aromatic molecules. We've discussed those in the past as well. Um, Polycyclic indicating that there are multiple rings associated with that molecule. Heterocycles are just rings that involve something aside from carbon, perhaps a nitrogen. Nitrosamines are interesting because they involve compounds that are present in meat as a preservative, nitrates and nitrites. But at high temperature, those molecules also begin to react with the protein, generating highly toxic molecules. Now, again, we like the charred flavor that burning meat imparts to the product. So this is a double-edged sword. In terms of contaminants of other organisms, we can think about bacterial contamination first. Salmonella is something that we've discussed in the context of eggs earlier in the semester. Can cause severe gastrointestinal distress. E. coli as well is something that is very common to find meat contaminated with E. coli. E. coli is a enteric bacterium, that is to say, present as a symbiont, if you will, in the GI tract of many organisms. Wonderful as long as it's there, but once it's out and contaminating meat that we consume, it can become dangerous. What I'd like to point out, though, is that there are dozens of strains of E. coli, Escherichia coli, the bacterium, that are not toxic to humans. Some are, and those are the ones that we hear about. So it's important to remember that whenever you hear E. coli, not all E. coli is bad. Lots of E. coli is perfectly wonderful for us. This particular strain is one that we hear a lot about, O157H7. We won't talk about the significance of that name. It's beyond the scope of our course, but let it just be known that this strain produces a toxin that disrupts the DNA replication. Now, every time a cell has to divide, it has to reproduce its entire genome so that you have two copies for the two cells that are the products of division. The toxin generated by E. coli, it's a Shiga-like toxin, destroys that capability. So no DNA replication, no cell division, cell death. Right? This is the basis of the toxicity of that particular strain. And lots of bacteria generate this kind of toxin. And often the ability of production of that toxin is a product of lateral gene transfer, that is to say, transfer of genes between organisms. That's an interesting sideline. Other parasites, non-bacterial, multicellular. Trichinella. Trichinella spiralis is one of 8 or 10 roundworm species that contaminate meat products, particularly pork is a hazard. This was a particular concern earlier in the 20th century. Not terribly problematic parasite currently, but in any case associated with undercooked meat, just as bacterial contamination is. On the left here, we're looking at the larval form of the, that's not correct. That is the roundworm. What we worry about in consuming undercooked meat products is the transfer of the larva, shown here on the right, that's interspersed within muscle tissue. When we consume undercooked muscle tissue, that muscle tissue can contain the larva of the trichinella worm that has not been killed. And so when we consume that, it begins its life cycle again, emerging from the digested meat tissue in our GI tract as adults, and then reproducing, and then the larvae go on to infect our own muscle tissue, and this can set up quite a cycle that's very difficult to eradicate, with the main symptom, of course, being the presence of these worms in the GI tract and their adult form. But again, they go round and round, reinfecting that host with their larva. Again, severe gastrointestinal distress symptoms associated with trichinella. Very important and interesting, mad cow disease is in a class of diseases known as amyloidogenic diseases. These are really interesting diseases to me because they involve the misbehavior of proteins and not necessarily the transmission of a disease from, say, a bacterium or other parasite or virus. These are strictly protein encoded diseases. Amyloid referring, of course, to the structures that are formed in the brain tissue of Alzheimer's patients. Amyloid plaques or fibers of protein that accumulate as these toxic proteins begin to precipitate into fiber structures. But let's back up. Mad cow disease is actually a disease contracted by cows as a result of the upscale of meat production. Now, we're not going to talk so much about meat industry in this class, but let's remind ourselves that the only way that we can support the meat demand in our society is by having very large-scale meat production facilities. And part of that scale-up involves changing the way that we feed those beef. They're not usually fed on grass. They're usually fed on complicated feed products. And as an efficiency measure, many of those feeds are constructed from animal tissue. In particular, what led to the development of mad cow disease in Britain originally was the addition of sheep neural tissue, that is brain or spinal tissue, into the feed of the cows. Now, you may be aware that sheep were also suffering from a disease called scrapie, which is a degenerative disease of the neural tissue, and that disease was transmitted to the cows by consumption of the sheep's neural tissue. The disease is also known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, or mad cow disease. Let's think briefly about exactly what that disease refers to. There's a protein called a prion protein present in the diseased individual that has the ability to change the structure of other prion proteins that it encounters that are healthy. So you have two forms of the prion protein, toxic and healthy. And when the toxic form encounters a healthy form, it converts it to the toxic form, and they then precipitate and form these fibrous structures, similar to what one would see in an Alzheimer's patient. So this is a disease of protein misfolding, and I'm calling it a toxin not in the same sense as the toxin that destroys DNA replication. It's more a toxin in the sense that the precipitated protein that forms is detrimental to the life cycle of the cells that it's forming inside of. So the spongiform, it refers to the holes that are formed in the brain as the nerve tissue dies around the amyloid or around the precipitated proteins. One other point, and I know I'm hammering this a lot, but it's a protein folding question, so I'm really interested in it. One really important point is that the transmission of a disorder by a protein without an organism like a bacterium or a virus to transmit some genetic material as well was a very big deal in the latter part of the 20th century. This is a protein-only disease transfer mechanism, and it got its discoverer the Nobel Prize. So far was this class of diseases from what we normally consider a standard disease transfer mechanism. So Now, many steps have been put in place to ensure that that kind of tissue is not incorporated into the feed of animals, and we see a decrease in the incidence of mad cow disease. Before we leave this slide, let me say one more time that we can categorize the kinds of disorders that arise because of the consumption of meat into a few different categories. Those those disorders that are generated by the way that we prepare the meat, e.g., burning the meat and creating these carcinogenic and other toxic compounds. Parasites, be they unicellular or multicellular, that we can destroy by proper preparation. So, cooking at high temperature, greater than 180 degrees frequently, will serve to destroy all of the particular organisms that can contaminate meat. And then there are other diseases that are more complicated, arising from misfolding of proteins. But let's turn to the cows. I just wanted to show you a nice picture of some of the cows that we use as beef in our United States cattle herd. Here I'm showing 7 breeds of cows. According to the USDA, these cows comprise almost all of the beef produced within the United States. You are all probably familiar with the Hereford or Angus cows. Angus, we have black or red cows. There are a few others that are common in the United States, often used for breeding with Angus or Herefords to give particular characteristics. Interestingly, these are mostly named after the regions where they were first bred: Limousin, Simmental, Charolais. These were developed. The Limousin and Charolais developed in France. The Simmental developed in Switzerland. The Gelbve or yellow cow developed in Germany. I won't say too much about any of these in particular, aside from the fact that what they've been bred for is a very high production of meat in a very short period of time. Some of these are known for their persistence on poorer quality fodder, and they might be more applicable in very specific sorts of environments. Although most of the time now, the beef herd is less grass and grain fed and more fed on these complex feed supplies. So there they are, our steaks. What can we say about the production of meat and meat qualities? So in the United States, we have a couple of different mechanisms for rating the quality of meat. Let's begin with what's probably most familiar to us is the quality grades. There's prime beef, choice beef, select beef, standard or commercial beef, and utility cutter or canner beef. All of this has to do with the amount of marbling through the meat. Marbling, again, is that intramuscular fat concentrations, and that's really obvious when you look at this prime cut of beef, considered the best cut of beef. Right? You can see not only is there this subcutaneous layer of fat that surrounds the muscle and connects one muscle to another, but even within the muscle tissue itself, there's a lot of fat laid down. As we step down from prime through choice, we see markedly less marbling, and then again, and select, even less marbling. And what this affects is the tenderness of the meat and its ability to be cooked, and especially by broiling. As we go down in quality, we begin to become more and more lean. Most of the meat is tender, especially sirloins, but most of the time we're talking about having to marinate that beef as we do lose some tenderness and flavor, frankly, which, as we know now, is part of the most important aspect of marinating. Interestingly, so these are what you might see in the grocery store, and depending on the grocery store you shop at, you might only see prime and choice and none of the other grades. You're not usually going to see standard or commercial stamped on there, but this is going to be an ungraded store brand. And the utility stuff you don't ever see at all except as ground beef and then as processed meats. Very interestingly, though, you might look at this and say, that looks too fatty, I wouldn't like that. And in fact, all of these categories are very subjective and subject to change. In fact, in 1965 and 1975, the marbling requirements for what constituted prime beef, good job, Oscar, the were degraded or lowered so that something that otherwise would have been considered low-grade meat was now prime, as the tastes of the American population seemed to change. We prefer now less well-marbled beef, leaner beef. Okay, this is what we normally see in the grocery store. Rarely do we think about this other kind of grading. This has more to do with the cattle going into the slaughterhouse than what appears in the grocery store, but let's talk about it anyway. There are several grades of yield, and they refer to the ratio of lean to fat, or really referring to the quantity of meat that's being produced by the cow. And let's see, the best of these are usually going to be Herefords. As I mentioned, that's what the principal meat supply in the United States is composed of, and they have a yield grade. A yield grade of 1 is about 52% boneless retail cuts. So there's a complicated conversion to go between how much lean and how much fat there is to exactly how much meat we're getting off of that. 52% is yield grade 1. Less than 45% is all the way down at yield grade 5, and that's going to be Holsteins, which are not bred for beef. You will remember that Holsteins are bred for milk production. Still, they can be sold as meat, and they're going to have a significantly lower quantity of meat on the bone.